courtroom was alive with the usual hum of anticipation. Lawyers rustled papers, spectators whispered in hushed tones, and in a distant chamber, the steady strike of a gavel punctuated the atmosphere. Judge Eleanor Hayes sat at the bench, her gaze unwavering and professional. It was another day, another case, or so she had assumed until the bailiff announced the matter at hand. The state of Louisiana versus James Anderson. Eleanor shifted slightly in her seat, her hands resting lightly on the polished oak of the bench. Before her lay the case files, charges of assault, robbery, and resisting arrest. All details that painted a grim portrait of yet another soul lost in the complex web of a flawed system. As the defendant was led into the courtroom, the ambient hum of expectation grew into a charged silence. When the man was finally brought before her, shackled at the wrists and ankles, something inside Eleanor shifted. The man standing there was not a stranger, he was James Anderson. Her James. In that moment, her throat constricted as memories surged forth like an unstoppable tide. Summer afternoons spent racing bicycles down the dusty streets of Hammond, Louisiana. The secret. Late-night conversations under the magnolia tree in her backyard, and the promises they had once made as children, pledging to always have each other's backs, regardless of the world's cruelty. But the man before her was no longer the carefree boy of her past. His shoulders were hunched, and his face bore the deep lines of hardship accumulated over years of struggle. Yet, despite the toll of time and experience, his eyes, those deep, soulful eyes, remained achingly familiar. For the first time in her long and storied career, Eleanor's firm grasp on the gavel wavered. She hesitated, and for an agonizing moment the courtroom seemed to shrink, as if the walls themselves were closing in, forcing her to confront the impossible. James looked up briefly. His expression was a complex mixture of shock and resignation. Recognition flickered in his eyes, only for him to quickly avert his gaze and bow his head, as though overwhelmed by the weight of the past. The room waited, heavy with unspoken tension, as Eleanor finally forced herself to speak. "Mr. Anderson," she said in a voice that was steady yet tinged with personal sorrow, "you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" In response, James's voice emerged, rough, scarcely recognizable from the echoes of a long-forgotten youth, as he replied, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. In that instant, she longed to stop time and demand the answers that had haunted her for so long. What had become of him? How had their lives diverged so drastically over the years? But her duty demanded composure. "Proceed," she instructed evenly as the prosecutor began his opening statements. Even as the prosecutor's measured tones filled the courtroom, Eleanor's mind wandered back to a time before the weight of responsibility had gripped her so tightly. Long ago, before she wore the black robes and wielded the gavel of authority, she and James had grown up in Hammond, Louisiana. Children from two very different worlds. Her family's home was modest, a one-story house with a white picket fence symbolizing simplicity and hope, while James's family resided in a weathered home at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by vast fields and the unspoken realities of segregation. Their friendship had been an anomaly in a town divided not by miles, but by invisible barriers, a secret bond forged in the innocence of youth. She remembered the day they met as if it were yesterday. Wandering too far from her own backyard, Eleanor had stumbled upon a quiet creek. There, by the water's edge, James was fishing, his line dangling loosely. In that moment of serendipity, as the gentle murmur of the stream mingled with the rustle of leaves, she had offered him a helping hand when his line became hopelessly tangled in the reeds. That small act of kindness sparked a friendship that blossomed into years of secret adventures, shared dreams, and whispered promises. "You ever think about leaving this place?" James had asked one balmy summer night as they lay on the grass beneath a canopy of stars. "Really getting out, going somewhere where people don't look at us funny just for sitting together?" She had laughed, dismissing the idea as nothing more than a fanciful musing. Yet even then, James had been serious. He had seen the world for what it truly was, a place that did not always make room for people like him. Their bond deepened in spite of the constant pressure, the sideways glances, the disapproving murmurs from both sides, and the ever-present weight of societal prejudice. For months, They had walked aside the city with constant levels of conversation. The way they moved felt always to distance but inevitably the fragile magic of their youth was shattered. It was the summer before high school when Eleanor's father caught them together on the porch. His voice had been cold and unyielding as he commanded, "Eleanor, get in. Now!" With a resigned whisper, James had murmured, "Go on." His tone laced with the sorrow of a friendship doomed by circumstance. That day marked the end of an era. They would barely see each other again. Her father forbade her from being near James, and soon after, his family moved away. In the years that followed, Eleanor threw herself into her studies. Her ambitions carried her far beyond the confines of Hammond, and she eventually attended law school, driven by dreams of justice and fairness. But she never forgot the boy who had taught her the true meaning of courage. Now, as she sat in the courtroom, Eleanor found herself wondering what had become of James. His record was a series of minor infractions, petty thefts, instances of loitering, hardly a record that screamed violence. Yet she knew too well that a few lines on a rap sheet could never capture the full complexity of a person's life. Just then, the prosecutor's voice cut through her reverie. He described the alleged crime. James was accused of assaulting a store clerk during a robbery at a convenience store in Baton Rouge. The clerk had sustained minor injuries and the cash register had been emptied. James, he said, was apprehended a few blocks away, with the cash allegedly still in his possession. Eleanor's eyes fixed on James as the prosecutor spoke. His posture was slouched, his hands tightly clasped in front of him, yet his expression remained an enigma. Was he truly the criminal the prosecution claimed him to be, or was there another side to the story? A side that the evidence did not fully reveal. The courtroom eventually adjourned for a lunch break, offering Eleanor a brief reprieve to gather her thoughts. In her chambers, her assistant Margaret approached cautiously. "Judge Hayes, are you all right? You seem a bit distracted," Margaret asked softly. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, wrestling with the impulse to confide that she knew the defendant, even if only in passing, but professionalism demanded restraint. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice quiet yet taut with emotion. "Just a lot on my mind." Deep down, however, Eleanor knew that she was far from fine. The past, so long buried, now loomed just a few feet away, an ever-present reminder of a bond that had once meant everything. When the trial resumed, the courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled frantically, the clerk shuffled his papers, and the prosecutor, a sharply dressed man named Richard Powell, stepped forward to deliver his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began in a firm, commanding tone, "this case is about violence. It is about a man who walked into a convenience store and, without provocation, attacked an innocent clerk before stealing the contents of the cash register. The evidence will show that James Anderson is guilty of these crimes." Eleanor felt a tightening knot in her stomach as Powell's voice, clinical and detached, reduced James to little more than a name on a docket. A moment later, the defense attorney, Lisa Porter, rose to present her opening statement. Young yet exuding confidence, her voice carried clearly across the room. "The prosecution would have you believe that this case is straightforward," she declared. "But it is not. My client, James Anderson, has maintained his innocence from the very beginning. We will show that there is far more to this story than the assumptions made on the night of his arrest." The first witness called to the stand was a store clerk who had worked on the night of the incident. He described in meticulous detail how he had seen a man matching James's description enter the store, engage in a heated argument with the cashier, and then lunge over the counter. Despite the detailed nature of his testimony, something about his account felt rehearsed. Under Lisa's rigorous cross-examination, his responses were probed with surgical precision. "Mr. Chambers," she asked deliberately, "you stated that the man who attacked the clerk was wearing a red hoodie, is that correct?" "Yes," he replied. "Did you see his face clearly?" "Not really, it was dark and he had the hood pulled up." Lisa's eyes narrowed as she continued. "So you could not definitively identify the individual who committed the assault?" The witness's hesitation confirmed her suspicions. "No, I couldn't," he admitted, and with that, Lisa concluded her questioning. Eleanor noted a subtle shift in James at that moment. His shoulders straightened just slightly, as if the exchange had rekindled a faint hope within him. Next, the prosecution presented a surveillance video from the store. The footage, grainy and poorly lit, showed a figure in a red hoodie entering the store, swiftly grabbing at the counter and then disappearing off-screen. While the prosecution argued that this figure was James, the low quality of the video made it difficult to confirm any definitive identifying features. Eleanor studied the footage intently, silently questioning, could this truly be James? The figure moved with a speed and fluidity that rendered him almost like a shadow, leaving an unsettling gap in the narrative. Much of James's defense hinged on an alibi. He claimed that he had been walking home from a friend's house at the time of the robbery. However, the friend was unwilling to testify, citing a fear of retaliation from the community. Lisa Porter argued that while the absence of a willing witness did not conclusively prove James's innocence, it certainly cast serious doubt on the prosecution's case. The jury's expressions ranged from skeptical to uncertain as the trial wore on. Throughout these proceedings, Eleanor felt the heavy burden of her dual responsibilities. She was meant to be the epitome of impartiality, a pillar of fairness. But how could she remain so when every moment in the courtroom reminded her of their shared past? The boy who had once been her closest friend was now standing before her, a man fighting for his freedom, and it was her solemn duty to determine his fate. When the court finally adjourned for the day, Eleanor lingered at the bench, her fingers tracing the smooth edge of the gavel. She longed to speak with James privately, to ask him what had truly happened, but she knew that any contact outside the courtroom would not only jeopardize the case, but could also endanger her career. When the trial resumed, the atmosphere was charged with quiet murmurs. At that moment, the defense's turn arrived, and Lisa Porter called her first key witness, Officer Daniel Harris, the arresting officer. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she watched Harris take the stand. "Officer Harris," Lisa began calmly, "you were the one who apprehended my client, correct?" "That is correct," Harris replied in a clipped tone. "According to your report, Mr. Anderson was seen walking 2 blocks from the scene of the robbery when you detained him. Is that correct?" "Yes," Harris confirmed. "What led you to believe that he was the suspect?" Harris shifted slightly in his seat. He fit the description, a black male in his mid-40s wearing dark clothing. Lisa's eyebrows arched slightly. "Dark clothing, you say? Yet, the suspect in the video was described as wearing a red hoodie. Did you find a red hoodie in Mr. Anderson's possession during your search?" Harris hesitated. "No, I did not, though he might have discarded it." Lisa stepped closer, her tone measured. "Could you or any other officer confirm that?" Harris's jaw tightened as he replied, "No, we didn't have time to search the surrounding area thoroughly. He was apprehended quickly." Lisa pressed further. "So to clarify, you arrested my client based solely on a vague description without any physical evidence linking him to the scene?" Harris fell silent, a silence that spoke volumes. Eleanor's gaze shifted to the jury. Several members exchanged uncertain glances. Lisa continued, "Officer Harris, do you recall if Mr. Anderson said anything at the time of his arrest?" "He did protest," Harris answered shortly, saying he was innocent. "And did you consider investigating his claim, or did you simply assume guilt based solely on his appearance?" Harris's face reddened as he muttered, "I followed protocol." Lisa repeated the words slowly. "Protocol." Her tone was laced with skepticism. "No further questions, Your Honor," she concluded. As Officer Harris stepped down, visibly shaken and with his credibility in tatters, the courtroom buzzed once again. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. This trial had evolved beyond a mere case of robbery and assault. It had become a reckoning for an entire system, too eager to condemn without fully understanding the truth. In an unexpected twist, Lisa Porter introduced an expert witness, a forensic analyst who had meticulously reviewed the surveillance footage. The analyst explained that, based on the height and build of the individual captured on video, there was no definitive way to confirm his identity as James Anderson. Moreover, the analyst revealed that the timestamp on the footage had been altered, raising serious doubts about its reliability. Although the prosecutor attempted to dismiss this testimony as conjecture, the jury's expressions betrayed their growing uncertainty. A shadow of doubt began to creep into the room, and Eleanor could feel its weight as the day drew to a close. At long last, James was given the opportunity to testify on his own behalf. Despite warnings from his defense counsel, he insisted on taking the stand. As he approached, the soft clinking of his chains resonated through the silence. His voice, though quiet, carried a raw sincerity. "I've made mistakes in my life," he began, addressing the jury directly. "I have taken wrong turns and trusted the wrong people, but I did not commit this crime. That night I was simply walking home, minding my own business, when the police stopped me. They did not ask questions. They merely decided that I fit the bill." His voice cracked as he continued, "I have spent my whole life fighting to be seen as more than the labels others place on me, but now I'm tired. I just want the truth to matter." Eleanor's throat tightened as she listened. His words were not only a plea for justice, but also a desperate call for humanity. Eleanor glanced around at the jury. Their faces reflected a complex blend of doubt, empathy, and uncertainty. In that charged moment, the truth was no longer confined to cold evidence or rigid testimonies. It had become a battle of conscience, a struggle against the weight of prejudice and assumption. Eleanor understood that her role was not simply to uphold the law, it was to interpret it in a manner that truly served justice. The final day of the trial dawned heavy with anticipation. Closing arguments were delivered with precision. The prosecutor leaned on circumstantial evidence, urging the jury to trust in the system's process, while Lisa Porter implored them to see beyond the superficial details, to recognize the gaps in the case and to consider the humanity of the man on trial. Eleanor listened intently, her face remaining impassive, though her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. She knew her role was clear. She could not sway the jury, but she would have the final word if their verdict allowed any ambiguity. The burden of ensuring that justice was served weighed heavily on her. Hours passed as the jury deliberated. The courtroom emptied and refilled as people stretched their legs and whispered among themselves. Throughout it all, James sat quietly, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes fixed on the table, as though searching for a flicker of hope in the solemn silence. He had looked to Eleanor from the very first day of the trial, silently pleading for an explanation, a hope that perhaps, despite everything, she might find a way to reconcile the painful past with the present. Finally, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room fell into an excruciating silence as 4 jurors stood, and a single piece of paper trembled in Eleanor's hands. In the case of the state of Louisiana versus James Anderson, we find the defendant, the pause was agonizingly long, not guilty. In an instant, the courtroom erupted into a cacophony of gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers. Eleanor tapped her gavel sharply to restore order. James's shoulders sagged as though a tremendous weight had been lifted, yet his face remained inscrutable. He had won his freedom, but it was painfully evident that this victory came at a great cost. Eleanor addressed the court in a steady, measured voice. "The jury has spoken, Mr. Anderson. You are free to go." As the courtroom gradually emptied, Eleanor lingered behind, watching James sign his release paperwork. For a brief moment, she wondered if he might leave without uttering another word. Instead, he turned and approached her. With only a few clerks tidying up and Margaret gathering files, James stopped a few feet from the bench, his expression guarded and reflective. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly, "but I would like to know." "Why didn't you say anything? You knew me." Eleanor's throat tightened, and her words caught in her throat. "I couldn't," she managed to reply, her voice barely a whisper. "I had to be fair. Any personal comment might have jeopardized the case." James studied her, his expression a blend of hurt and understanding. "Fair?" he murmured. "That's the thing. The world has never been fair, not for people like me." Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes dropping to the polished wood of the bench. "You're right. I wish I had done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." James sighed softly, and the tension in his posture eased ever so slightly. "We were just kids," he said quietly. "We didn't know any better, but you know now, don't you?" "I do," Eleanor replied firmly, "and I am truly sorry." With a faint nod, James turned and walked away, his back straight and resolute as he disappeared through the courthouse doors. Left alone in the now empty courtroom, Eleanor sat in silence, the weight of her decisions and the burden of her role pressing down on her. She had upheld the law, Yet the trial had revealed a deeper truth, that justice was not merely about verdicts and evidence, but about the lives shaped by systems far larger than any single person. For Eleanor, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that her position was not just a seat of power, but a platform for change. As she left the courtroom that evening, the fading sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, and Eleanor made a silent vow. She could not change the past, but she would do everything in her power to ensure that the future held more than hollow promises of fairness. It would be a long, arduous journey, perhaps even an impossible one at times, but she owed it to James and to herself to try. In the days and weeks that followed, the courtroom drama gave way to a quieter, more reflective period. Eleanor found herself revisiting the memories of her childhood with James, the promises they had made, and the painful transformation that time had wrought. These recollections fueled her determination to reform the justice system from within. She resolved to ensure that no more lives would be reduced to mere statistics or case numbers. Instead, every individual, no matter how broken or misunderstood, would be seen as a person deserving of dignity and respect. Eleanor began to understand that her role extended far beyond that of a judge. It was not enough to simply interpret the law. She needed to be a champion for those caught in the system's ruthless gears. Her heart ached with the realization that so many lives were shaped by forces far beyond the courtroom's walls. This realization drove her to adopt a new philosophy, a belief that true justice demanded not only the fair application of the law, but also a commitment to nurturing change in the community. At subsequent trials, Eleanor carried this lesson with her. She listened more intently, questioned more deeply, and, in subtle ways, allowed her compassion to guide her decisions. Though the courtroom remained a place of formal proceedings and strict decorum, Eleanor's presence began to convey an unspoken message, that every case was more than just a file number, that every defendant had a story, and that every verdict had the power to shape lives. Over time, her colleagues began to notice a shift in her demeanor, a quiet, steadfast commitment to ensuring that justice was served in its truest sense. One evening, as Eleanor left the courthouse under the glow of a fading sunset, she paused to reflect on the events of the day. The memory of her confrontation with James Anderson, the anguish in his eyes, the sorrow in her own heart remained vivid. It was a painful reminder of the cost of indifference and the price of apathy in a system that too often overlooked the human element. Yet, even as she carried that burden, Eleanor felt a spark of hope. She believed that if she could inspire change within her own department, that change might ripple outwards, touching countless lives and transforming a broken system into one that truly served the people. In the months that followed, Eleanor became more vocal about her vision for reform. She initiated discussions on implicit bias, fairness in sentencing, and the importance of community outreach. She pushed for greater transparency in her courtroom and worked tirelessly to ensure that every decision was made with both justice and compassion in mind. Her actions did not go unnoticed. Many in the community began to see her not only as a judge but as a symbol of hope, a reminder that change was possible even in the most entrenched systems. One day, after a particularly challenging case, Eleanor sat alone in her chambers and wrote in her journal about the lessons she had learned. She wrote about the profound impact of recognizing the humanity in every individual, the necessity of holding those in power accountable, and the importance of never allowing the bitterness of the past to cloud the promise of the future. In that moment of solitude, Eleanor realized that true justice was not achieved through punishment alone, but through the relentless pursuit of equality and understanding. As the years passed, Eleanor's courtroom became a place where every voice was heard and every person was treated with dignity. The trial of James Anderson remained etched in her memory as a turning point, a moment when she was forced to confront the painful intersection of personal history and professional duty. It was a case that had revealed the deep scars left by systemic injustice, and it had ignited within her a burning resolve to transform the judicial system from within. In her closing address at a high-profile community meeting, Eleanor spoke with quiet authority and heartfelt conviction. "Justice," she declared, "is not just about the verdicts we pronounce or the laws we enforce. It is about the lives we touch, the hope we inspire, and the future we build together. Let us remember that every person who walks through these doors is more than a case number. They are a human being with dreams, struggles, and an inherent right to be seen and heard." I vow to continue fighting for a system that honors that truth, one where compassion and accountability walk hand in hand." Her words resonated deeply with the gathered community. Many left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose, and whispers of change began to spread. Eleanor's journey had become a beacon for those who believed that the pursuit of justice was a noble, if challenging, endeavor. And though the path ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, she was determined to see it through. In that same spirit of transformation, Eleanor recalled the painful lessons of the James Anderson trial. A trial that had not only exposed the shortcomings of the justice system, but had also illuminated the strength required to overcome them. It was a stark reminder that the road to reform was paved with both hardship and hope. Every challenge, every moment of discomfort, was an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to become a better guardian of justice. As Eleanor left the courthouse that day, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows on the steps, she carried with her a quiet determination. She knew that the trial had changed her, had forced her to look inward and to confront the very nature of fairness and accountability. And in that transformation, she found a renewed sense of purpose. A calling to ensure that no more lives would be diminished by a system that failed to see the humanity in each individual. In the months and years that followed, Eleanor's influence extended far beyond the courtroom. Her tireless advocacy for reform began to inspire colleagues, community leaders, and even the next generation of legal professionals. She mentored young judges, participated in community outreach programs, and spoke at conferences about the need for systemic change. Her story became one of resilience and renewal, a testament to the power of integrity and the unyielding pursuit of justice. For Eleanor, every case that came before her was a reminder that the truth was multifaceted, that every verdict carried the weight of countless lives, and that true justice required empathy as much as it required the letter of the law. The trial of James Anderson had been a crucible, a moment when the personal and the professional collided in ways she had never anticipated. And though it had left her with a heavy heart, it had also sparked within her a determination to build a future where fairness was more than an ideal, but a lived reality for everyone. Now, as she continued her work in the courtroom, Eleanor carried with her the memory of that fateful day. She remembered the way James's eyes had flickered with a mix of shock and resignation, the bittersweet recollections of childhood promises, and the silent, profound hope that even the most damaged soul could be redeemed. These memories became the fuel that drove her to seek not only legal justice but social justice, a justice that embraced compassion, respect, and true equality. In reflecting on her journey, Eleanor often thought of the words of a mentor from her early days on the bench. "The law may be blind, but justice is not." Those words had taken on a new meaning after the trial. No longer could she allow herself to be an indifferent enforcer of rules. Instead, she had to be a vigilant guardian of the ideals that the law was meant to serve. And in doing so, she had come to understand that every person, regardless of their past or the circumstances of their arrest, deserved the chance to be seen as whole and human. Eleanor's transformation, ignited by the trial of James Anderson, gradually rippled throughout the entire community. Her steadfast commitment to reform began to change the culture of the courthouse, and her influence grew steadily as more people, both within the department and outside it, started to believe that change was possible. Her resolve to confront prejudice head-on, to question assumptions, and to hold every officer accountable for their actions became the cornerstone of a new era in Blue Ridge's justice system. At a later public forum, as Eleanor addressed a diverse group of community members and law enforcement officers alike, she spoke with unwavering clarity. "Our duty as protectors of the law," she said, "is not merely to enforce it, but to embody its highest ideals. We must remember that justice is not served by silence in the face of prejudice, nor is it delivered by the unchecked abuse of power. It is our responsibility to ensure that every individual is treated with dignity, that every voice is heard, and that every action we take builds towards a future where fairness is not just a promise, but a reality." Her words were met with respectful applause, and in that moment, Eleanor felt the deep connection between her work and the lives of those she served. The courtroom, once a place of cold procedures and impersonal judgments, had transformed into a space where every case was a chance to mend the fractures in society, a place where the pursuit of justice was not an abstract ideal, but a tangible, living commitment. As Eleanor concluded the session, she offered a final, heartfelt appeal. Let us use our positions, whether as judges, officers, or community members, to build bridges of understanding and to confront the injustices that have long divided us. In doing so, we honor not only the law, but also the humanity that it is meant to protect. Together, we can forge a path towards true justice, one where every person is valued, every voice is heard, and every life is given the chance to flourish. In the quiet that followed, as the audience slowly dispersed, Eleanor remained at the podium, her heart heavy with the responsibilities of her role, but also filled with hope for the future. The trial had not only tested her, but had also transformed her, challenging her to look beyond the cold mechanics of the legal system and to embrace a vision of justice that was as compassionate as it was fair. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long, lingering shadows across the courthouse steps, Eleanor made a silent vow. She promised herself that no matter the obstacles, no matter how deeply ingrained the prejudices might be, she would continue to fight for a system that honored the dignity of every individual. She would use her position not merely to pass judgment, but to instigate change, ensuring that the future would hold more than empty promises, but a genuine commitment to fairness, equity, and respect for all. The legacy of that trial, with all its pain, revelation, and transformation, would live on in every decision Eleanor made, in every reform she championed, and in every life touched by the justice system under her stewardship. It was a legacy built not on the cold, hard facts of a case, but on the enduring belief that every person deserves a chance to be seen, heard, and understood. And as Eleanor Hayes left the courthouse that day, the memories of her past mingled with her vision for the future, forging a resolve that would guide her for the rest of her life.